Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 73rd episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Both of us have been pretty busy this week, but we want to sort of take a step back because sometimes, Matt and I can have pretty niche conversations, either about philosophy or policy, but we sort of want to take, if you'll pardon the phrase, a bird's eye view of the situation. We want to think about, maybe our place in history at the moment, or we want to think about how public policy plays into maybe the power dynamics that are going on, any like changes on the national or international scale that are going on. And so we just have a lot of like random thoughts about all of that. So I guess I'll just start a little bit. I was just saying to Matt, we were riffing a little bit before we started recording. And I was mentioning, I recently recorded a conversation with our friend Keegan, which I don't think it's been uploaded yet, but it was basically about what I term the technocratic revolution. And really what I mean by that is international organizations, really surrounding big corporations and finance. These multinational organizations are really pulling the strings behind the scenes, so to speak. It sounds mildly conspiratorial, but I think it's true. And the politics in like the UK's government or the US's government or Saudi Arabia's government at some level is less important than because I think these politicians are really getting their agenda, so to speak, from this technocratic elite. We've created a global order, if you will. Wow, I mean I'm really trying not to use conspiratorial language because I'm not trying to sound like a nut. But if you think about it, like in the 20th century, people kind of felt like nationalism was discredited due to Mussolini and Italy and Nazi Germany, of course. People thought that was like too primitive, too people who were nationalists were like stuck in the past, and this also derives from like our Enlightenment heritage and whatnot. Other stuff I mentioned in my conversation with Keegan, and so people kind of started taking an internationalist position. People like Woodrow Wilson, of course, the European Union, the United Nations, excuse me. These organizations started building up, started being created, but ultimately, I sort of think that we're having the language of like human rights and like internationalism is really a disguise for a global hierarchy, which is this neoliberal global hierarchy, which is it's really only helping a small minority of people, but at the same time, it's like the hierarchy is stable enough to where there aren't revolutions left and right all around the world, right? So it's a weird self-sustaining organism in which some people, say the people that matter, are getting at least a bit of benefit from it. So people in the West, have pretty good lives overall. And Africa and the Middle East and even parts of Asia, they're really struggling right now. But of course, they're also becoming more westernized, right? So they're trying to, a lot of our Western way of doing things is kind of being pushed onto them. So that's sort of a lot to throw out there. But I think Matt has a lot of thoughts on most of what I just said. So I'm going to shut up now.
Well, and so one of the reasons why I liked that we're kind of doing a freewheeling conversation instead of maybe trying to stick to something narrow is when one of us does kind of elaborate on any point, like 5 rabbit holes kind of open up. So one way to bounce off that, and then we'll decide if we want to dive into just that line of thought or not, or if I'll keep going. But it's the idea that you have people like, I mean, I think Keegan's an okay example, but he's like a somewhat of a nationalist. He's kind of in favor of like strongman leadership. And then you had like Trump as president kind of saying things about America first. And nationalism gets demonized in a certain light because of Trump's rhetoric. And you have a lot of outlets criticizing the worst of historical nationalism. And then when they argue for globalism, they're painting the best idea of globalism. And one could read something that like maybe I'm more amicable towards like Ludwig von Mises's Human Action and get the idea that Mises is a globalist, right? Because there's this idea in economics that if you're really good at something relative to the other things you're good at, you should specialize in it. And if you specialize in what you're good at and then you trade with people that are specialized in other things, everybody's better off. Because for me to maybe mow my lawn, it would take me 50 minutes, but I can hire like a 16-year-old to do it in 25, and I could do something that's much more valuable to other people with that 50 minutes, right? So it more than makes up for itself. So what ends up happening in a lot of discussions is you have people take the in-practice failure of either nationalism or globalism and then compare it to their ideal that doesn't exist of nationalism or globalism, whatever one they're in favor of. So right now it's very odd because you have people who are in favor of some sort of nationalism that they think could happen. And then the language against it is usually a type of globalism that isn't what exists today. And then you have a lot of people against our current globalist world order. And then the thing that they posit is a type of nationalism that doesn't really exist in practice either. It's like an uncorrupted nationalism, even though we know a nationalist government would probably be as likely to get corrupted as, you know, any other governmental system that's existed in the modern age. So I just think that's like a funny thought that comes to mind because it's just a way people think about it. It's like most convenient to themselves while least charitable. And I think that has to be taken into account even when we talk about the perils of globalism and maybe the benefits of nationalism, that nationalism is like very corruptible too. Even though we currently have a corrupt international world order, that doesn't mean nationalism would necessarily be much better. So that's my first thought. I can go more into some other strands of thought. Yeah.
Well, I guess if I can respond to that quickly. So yeah, I'm not even. I guess my opening statement is meant to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. I mean, I think ultimately the when internationalism. Well, I don't know. I sort of have like there's two, I guess, possibilities. Part of me thinks that like internationalism or globalism is out of the bag, and therefore it can't get, you know, you can't put it back in the bag, and that we're such a connected world that we're going to probably remain a connected world, you know, indefinitely. And you know, I do kind of consider myself a cosmopolitan, I guess, personally. Like I don't feel myself to be necessarily deeply connected with one country or another. I consider myself to be, or I want to feel connected with, or I feel connected with people, you know, ideas and people from all across the globe. But at the same time, as I said, I see this pernicious element in internationalism going on, and I wonder if like we're just going to see a trend towards increasing nationalism, if you know, because I guess that there is a question of like the technocratic revolution, will it last, or like the technocrats in charge, will they be able to govern everything? Or will there, you know, is our global affairs just so complex that ultimately, you know, some aspect of it or other is going to collapse, and that might lead to more local government, local action. I'm not really sure. That's not really, and I don't really like to predict the future because no one really is knows what's going to happen. So yeah.
So to some extent, I think an international system is a natural consequence of just what happens. And so to that degree, it's like, well, it is out of the bag and it is what it is. I think the question is like, how much power is concentrated in it, and what are the consequences of that power being concentrated there relative to if power was concentrated more in nations in themselves. Now, I will say one of the issues of international institutions that isn't even a part of the institution itself is how it makes other nations act. So I guess an example I'd give is there are a lot of problems in France, right? One off the top of my head is just the average unemployment level in France is just much higher than in the US, like on average in like a good times economic year. And that's for like very practical reasons that has to do with how it's harder to fire people in France. Like if you're essentially unionized in the fact that you're an employee in France. So if they want to get rid of you, it takes a lot more, which makes it more risky to hire somebody. If they turn out being a bad employee, you can't just can them like you can in the US more or less. So they just have higher employment. Well, if due to higher unemployment, you have certain cultural outgrowths, like that might be why you might see certain populist type movements in certain communities as a result of things like more unemployment. Instead of addressing hard questions, you can point to outside systems, right? So to some extent, most political campaigns either point outwards by pointing at the other party, or they can point outwards at something else they want to fight that the other party's not willing to fight. So this was Trump on China, right? He wasn't just hating on Hillary for being like a globalist. He was hating on Hillary for not being hard enough on the other enemies too. So this is like in France, you have like Marine Le Pen, she ran, and she's like a French nationalist, right? And people were very upset with like a lot of other things about her. But I'm pretty sure she was very critical of like the EU as a legislative body, as an international body. And that's just, it kind of doesn't necessarily mean it's because of the EU's policies. It could be because we can point at a villain, so the government isn't to blame here. That's what I think a lot of the people who criticize international structures in the US, or policies, or outcomes that are results of policies in the US will often point to international relationships. And I think that's misguided. That doesn't mean I don't think international institutions are evil. And I think the leaders are pretty nefarious. But I also think a lot of the traditional reasons we point and blame international institutions are like really misguided. Like things like production being in China or other lower income countries. Like that makes sense. And I would be willing to defend that beyond what like a lot of populist leaning people would be willing to like on trade. I'd be willing to defend a lot of globalist things that have happened. Now, like the global minimum corporate tax that Janet Yellen has gotten some other countries to sign on to, that's the type of internationalism that I think it's kind of sneaky and also like more nefarious. And it's not what's in the news because it's easier to point to unemployment in the US and then just scapegoat another country. And that's where I see it most commonly. So I almost think you do have to dissect a layer deeper to get to it. I did have one more thing, but I'll stop there.
I mean, I guess just to be clear, I'm not saying so much that, or just to clarify in case anyone listening is confused, I'm not saying so much like, the U.S. government is blameless because these horrible internationalist institutions are ruining everything. I'm so much saying, or I'm saying that a lot of the issues that we see in these governments, governments at the national level, they're coming from the issues that are related to these internationalist institutions. But we're sort of we really live in a time, and I'm kind of repeating some things I said with Keegan. So if you listen to both things, you're probably going to hear me say similar things. So I'm sorry about that. But we've really live in a time where we have a lot of competing values, and we're really having to decide which values that we truly want to defend and which values we're not willing to defend. So it's like there's a right wing and left wing spectrum of the globalist side of things. And then there's a right wing, left wing spectrum of the sort of nationalist side of things. So the populist movements that you refer to, such as the yellow vests in France, or Trump supporters, Bernie supporters, Many of those people are, are skeptical of free trade, and they're just and they want more control of the economy at the national level. And I and that's like it's an interesting it's an interesting phenomenon, because if you look at it historically, I think free trade did benefit the world more broadly. But at the same time, I think nowadays the opposite is happening. I don't think free trade is as great now as it used to be, because of these international bodies that are sort of using it for ends that it's becoming more complex, and the people that are getting rich from this international trade, it's not really going back into the country, into these nations, and what is it, the trickle down theory, whatever, blah blah blah. It's not like circling, as money's not circling and capital's not circling as freely as it once did. Again, as I said, part of that might just be the greater complexity of the economy, but I don't think like free trade is leading to the laissez-faire economics, say, that some people are advocating for, or some people who advocate for free trade are searching for, or wanting to implement. So that's just one example of, I think, a lot of these supposedly libertarian or conservative economic policies, they're not actually leading to the world, the libertarian or conservative world that is supposedly desirable in some of these people's arguments. And so, what's going to give? What values are going to give in? That's something we really have to consider deeply.
So I'm trying to make, okay, so hear me out a little bit. I think this is actually, and this is where I think we diverge the most then. I don't really think that this is much a question of values unless you're talking about international law trends, like across nations. Like if you're pointing to maybe the EU being a more anti-free speech region compared to the US, and how maybe they're exporting that, or maybe how certain third world countries are becoming more totalitarian and that's becoming a norm, then maybe I could see the values part. But I almost think the policy questions are not questions of values and more questions of rhetoric and outcomes. So I almost try to take the values out of it because the consequences seem fairly obvious. So when it comes to U.S. exporting production, right? So China is the production engine of a lot of the world. But even now, China's actually getting priced out of production, right? Because they've increased their wages enough, because there's been so much demand for them to produce things, that their wages have gone up in the urban areas. And I wish I knew the one that was overtaken off the top of my head, the country. But there's another small country that's becoming a powerhouse. Okay. But that's aside the point. The point is that drives down the cost of stuff. So somebody could say, well, the people who are making the money of those deals are wealthy business owners, and now they're just making a better, they're able to make things for cheaper. But it's like, yeah, and when there's competitions amongst production of cheap things, the price goes down. So even if this isn't reflected by higher job competition and higher salaries in the US for those workers, it's reflected in you can buy more stuff with a dollar. That's the idea there. So it doesn't have to show as the form of salaries for people who have a high school degree, because yeah, you're right. They don't have that necessary. If that force doesn't exist in the United States, the demand for their skills is lower. But everybody can now buy whatever good that is produced in a different country at a lower price. So like that is why it's valuable for people. Now, the issue is I think a lot of people like to assign blame and then say things shouldn't be their fault or their problem. And I know the word entitlement means something more narrow in politics usually, but I think there is a sense of I am entitled to a job because I exist, not because I actually do something that and it's not because I know a skill or can do something that somebody, wants me to do. And there is generally an inability for people at a certain age to be open to learning new skills or to be able to do it effectively. But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of jobs, but they're jobs that people think they're too good for. So people who've worked in types of jobs that are low skill, I guess to put it lightly, but are hard, do not want to transition into other low skill jobs that are hard because they're not jobs that they're experienced in or that they are open to doing. And that is a bigger problem for that sector than anything. And it's also people are really sticky about where they live. So in China, people aren't sticky about where they live. There's been a huge movement from rural to urban as those jobs have come there. In the United States, a lot of the people who are suffering in rural areas don't think I should take this other job somewhere else. And frankly, and this isn't to be mean, but it's to kind of show people could really help themselves in a lot of ways. There are dearths of there's so many job openings for jobs like truck car driver right now, but people don't want to be a truck car driver because it's stressful and you're away from home a lot. But the thing is, they make a ton of money without having a college degree, like relative to anybody else who tops out of high school. Like these are jobs that are not being filled in America that are much better than production jobs, and people don't take the steps to do it. And then they would be making more money than like college educated high 20s, early 30-year-olds. So it's like it's perplexing, and I think a lot of it is a projection of entitlement. And I know that's like Freudian, and I know that's a macro claim when I'm talking about a lot of people on the micro, but that's, I think, like very hard to deal with. So it's like the population isn't amenable to the realism of life that is change. And I think that's the real issue.
So just to be clear, we're having two separate conversations, and we're understanding each other perfectly clearly. But you're talking about one thing, and I'm talking about something else. So
I'm not trying to refute what you say. I'm building off it, right? That's why.
No, I know. I'm just because I'm responding to something very specific. Because again, not terribly well versed in economics. I think. So when I'm talking about values, I mean, this is the issue when we talk about human history, right? Because it's like, what's more important? Is it people's ideas? Is it the material conditions? Is it like, power dynamics? And so like a lot of the policies people like talk about, or a lot of like the social change that happens, people associate values with those policies or with that social change. And you can trace, through history, like, the history, or you can trace through history, like, certain values, leading to certain policies, or certain policies leading to certain values, whichever way you start. And you can see how kind of like those things have grown and changed and developed and evolved. And so my point is simply that, say the internationalism that many like intellectuals had in the past, I think it's leading to things that they wouldn't have thought about, and it's leading to like negative things that they wouldn't have like advocated for when they were advocating for internationalism, I'll just use that one example, but that's really the point I'm trying to hammer home, because it's very easy to like how you mentioned in the beginning of the episode, like, the positive side of internationalism, or sorry, positive and negative side of both nationalism and internationalism. And the thing is, like, we're in uncharted territory, really. We've never had this time here, like the history we're experiencing now has never happened before, and no one has ever really lived in a time quite like ours. You can draw some certain parallels here and there from various things, but again, with the internet, with an old media which still has a lot of influence, with the banking system, with neoconservative foreign policies, and all these things are like coming together to make a very strange world. So we can't really like look at the past, and we can't like say that the internationalism of the past holds now, or that the nationalism of the past holds now. We can look at history for just trends and patterns and maybe context, but we can't put the insight of previous thinkers and previous generations and just incorporate it into the 21st century. So I do actually think it's about values. But it's not just about values. It's also about power. It's also about material conditions. But I think a lot of the the messaging that we get on these issues, values are smuggled in, and so we're both not fans of neoconservative foreign policy, as anyone who watches the show regularly knows. But that comes from an idea of but democracy's good, and so if democracy's good, then everyone should have democracy. Well, it's shown that we're not good. The U.S., for example, is not good at exporting democracy, even if in theory that were a good thing. But it's those two values, democracy and can you have a democracy, but do you have to export democracy, or can democracy just be a local thing, and you don't worry about other countries? There's a competition of values, along with the material conditions we're faced with, along with the unending power struggles that are just part of human history and human life. So that's really what I was talking about earlier.
So when it comes to a lot of the big picture policies that are on the international level, I tried to make the distinction earlier, but maybe I think maybe I was unclear about it, that I think it's outcomes and rhetoric. And I guess you're honing in on the values. And I guess what I'm saying is those conversations of values in the international space, I think, aren't happening by design. I think they are just rhetorical justifications for things. So I think a lot of neoconservative policy has more to do with the US dollar hegemony than it does have to do with a genuine want of exporting democracy. I think that's the rhetoric. I think that's what a lot of pundits believe, and I think that's what Americans believe. But I think the reason why we have the persistent establishment warfare welfare state in the United States isn't a matter of values. I think it's a matter of this helps our ends, and our ends is securing oil contracts in the US dollars, so there's high demand for US dollars because oil is a way to solidify the US dollar, and we can't have the dollar crash. So I don't think that is a values question. I think when we talk about it as partisans, it is, but I think that's almost fake from reality, right? I don't think those things are actually connected. So that's why maybe I'm pushing back on framing it as values, because the term used, technocratic elite, I don't think they have values, and I don't think they're actually really exporting them. I think they're exporting consequences that they want under the guise of values.
So I'm trying to I don't really want to dwell too long onto this, but I'm trying to find a way to make this more concrete, because I'm really trying to say something very specific, which is we inherited values. And I do think that some of what's going on, both at the national and at the international scale, in terms of organizations and in terms of government policies and whatnot, they come out of conflicting values. I think every human being has values. I think even the technocratic elite has values. And I think because here's the thing, if you think so it's okay. I mean, again, as I said earlier, if you believe that one government is the best government, then it makes sense to say that everyone should have that government, right? Because it's the best government. And I know you don't like government, so it's but it's if that proposition holds, that this X is the best government, then why would you not say, oh yeah, everyone should have this government? And so out of our values that we got from our ancestors have come this belief in internationalism, this belief in a social system and a hierarchy which supposedly is supposed to make everybody's life better all around the world. Now, I think some of that, I mean, I think it's certainly a good bit of it is rhetoric, and I think there are plenty of cynical people who don't, and empty suits, and people who don't believe in anything. But well, actually, no. I'm gonna rephrase what I said. I think everyone does have values, but those values often it combines with, as I said, the power. I mean, everyone is involved in a power struggle, and part of that power struggle is values. Part of the ideological disagreements, the battle of ideas, whatever you want to call it, it's an extension of the power struggle that we talked about with Keegan and Kohei and whatnot. So I mean, another example. And again, I keep going back to what I said with Keegan. The new atheists, who I'm a big, who I read when I was a teen, and I quite enjoyed their work. They were like extremely hostile towards religion, and again, but then someone like Hitchens, who was a very brilliant guy in many ways, he became a neocon, and he became a neocon because it was like, well, we have to fight radical Islam because religion's evil, and we have to do something about it. And he genuinely thought democracy was a good thing, and he wanted to bring democracy to the Muslim world, right? So, but that was one value, that the criticism of religion or religious skepticism, and it was channeled into a neocon foreign policy, which I think is atrocious. So that's really another, maybe the best example I could come up with for not only conflicting values, but how values and action are often so out of whack, particularly in the modern world, because of the conflicting struggles that we're having, or the struggles we're having within ourselves, within communities, and so on.
See, like, I don't think the decision makers are like the people at the helm are having those debates. So that, I think that's just why I don't agree. Like, I just don't think that's the reality of it. I think that's interesting. And I also like the idea of the unintended consequences of a certain philosophy in the long run is like something that's very interesting to me, because that ties into like a lot of thoughts I have about certain views or characterizations of libertarianism. So like it does tie into some things that I am intrigued by. I just don't think people in the UN are really thinking that way. I think a lot of people are saying, why is this action best for myself and my shareholders? I don't mean it because they're a corporation. I mean it because everybody has shareholders in their life. For normal people, that's usually them and their family. But like a head of a state really cares about like themselves. Then it's like their government structures power, and then maybe personal enrichment if possible. So it's like, and maybe not all people in those positions of power are corrupt in that way, but maybe some of them are. It's just like these are things I think they're more likely to consider. So if the U.S. is thinking about how can we maintain our government's power, both nationally and internationally, there are things that concentrate power in national and international orders. So things like, and this is not to say the events are fake. I do not want that to, I need to clarify that up, because the example I was going to use is, everything with COVID-19. So when we have a thing happen that's like saying, hey, we have this virus that spreads rapidly and it's not like anything in recent history. Well, that like a crisis concentrates power in elites. And you can argue that lockdowns are the justified policy or aren't. The whole point is they didn't used to have the power to do certain things. Now they do in the name of something. So like events give nations and international organizations more power over more people's lives. Now, I'm not saying that they would design something like that. I'm more saying nations attempt to solidify their power at times. So it's like, this is what I was saying about neoconservative foreign policy. It's like, sure, it could be principled, but it could also be like, this solidifies our power by solidifying our currency. And I don't see why a nation wouldn't be concerned about that, because that's the whole reason like the Federal Reserve exists, is essentially designed to try and prop up the dollar by propping up American interests. and they think that's an engine to solidify power. So I think of it more on the power struggle end than I do think on the value end, with a few at the margin exceptions. But I think if it was really about values, we would hear a lot more criticism about certain nations like Russia and China in very specific, tangible ways. The fact that those things only manifest themselves in rhetoric and not usually like real penalties is what makes me cautious of assigning values. But I know I'm potentially getting us stuck in a time loop here. So if we want to dodge and move ahead, I'm comfortable with that. Or letting you get the last word is also fine.
Yeah, well, I'll just say one more thing that we can get out of this time loop. And that is, I'm really not even saying. I mean, values can be your pure. It can be purely your post hoc rationalization of the power game. But I don't think that means, because it really boils down to people generally don't wake up thinking that they're a bastard. People don't generally wake up thinking I'm a horrible, evil man who's doing this for purely cynical reasons. They find a way to justify it to themselves, and they find a way to justify it to other people. And I think a lot of the ways that humans try to justify their power games is through values. And maybe you can't get away from values, and maybe values are just inherently a human thing, even if they're more abstract and not something you find in the world. I guess that's really my piece said. It's not just about power games, but ultimately I think it does go back to power games. So
I think it might be a value to them, though. I think
sense.
Power being in the right people's hands might be an end in the way that a value is an end, right? So I think when Nikki Haley was in the UN, I think Nikki Haley thinks her value is America needs to look strong, right? So that's why she told off those countries. So it's the same value is to use to justify other things. So I agree that's values in a loose way. Then if we frame it that way. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to delve into. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, actually, this is sort of a side point, but I don't know how you feel about the EU. Sorry, not the EU, the UN. The EU is a little more complicated, but I don't know how you feel about the UN. But as far as I'm concerned, the UN is a completely superfluous, useless, meaningless organization. I know people like to crap on the UN and like to say, oh, the UN's big, evil, blah, 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 blah. The UN really has almost no power, and no one respects international law. When we did the Chomsky versus Foucault debate, and Chomsky was making the argument that, well, international law is actually a good thing because it is taking the values, about human rights and trying to expand it on a global scale. And he says, well, even if people don't, often follow it, just the fact that we attempted to export those values, or we attempted to universalize those values, is a moral achievement in and of itself. So even with international, even with international organizations, I think it's we have to discriminate between what international organizations we're talking about, and this is kind of going back to your point earlier, and what international organizations are actually at fault, or what international organizations just kind of the window dressing. The UN is just window dressing, in my opinion.
I think the UN is a critical function in a nefarious way. So I think the UN is a laundering organization. I don't think it's necessarily a money laundering organization, although to some extent it probably is, in the sense that they hire a lot of people who work in various types of research and people who are ex-government officials, and they pay them some amount. But I also think they're gosh, I'm struggling with words today. It's a faux out. It's an outlet that gives faux okay, I'm struggling with a few words here. It gives credibility. That's a good word for it. It gives credibility to things that do not have earned credibility. So it uses its namesake and its organization to, I'm kind of saying they're laundering policy, but it's almost like they're a think tank that is universally respected and can be painted as bipartisan, even though nobody respects them. So if anybody cites the UN in terms of their research or in terms of their policy recommendation, for some reason that is universally acceptable and credible in the contemporary discourse, and pushing back against that is not an acceptable thing to generally do unless you're like a high level expert. Because it's like, well, it's the UN. This is like not like a Republican document. It's not a Democrat document. But in reality, the UN has agendas, just like Republicans and Democrats do. And then they sow this fake credibility onto all sorts of really partisan, ideologically driven legislation. And then it's like, well, the UN says to do this, so we're being we're being the respectable people by following it. And this is something I wanted to get at because you were using the term technocrats a lot. And it's this idea of technocracy, but it's also this idea of scientism. And it's not like, I'm not talking about literal science in a lab, but I'm talking about this idea that we have put on economists and financial analysts and all sorts of bureaucrat this facade of scientism to all their work. Because if you try to follow what a lot of people are doing, it is so academic and intense, and it has this faux precision. Like this is the most devastating thing about statistics, is it can be used in some really good ways. But if it's used wrong, it looks precise. So even if it's used like in a way that it probably shouldn't be used, it looks precise. And because of its precision, it has this dressing of credibility. This is what I think the UN does all the time. So they're a laundering tool for policies. And now that it's acceptable, I mean, the UN studied it, and the UN's given it's given recommendations on what should be done. Then the states can do it, and it's not radical policy anymore. But if it didn't have a certain amount of things to cite to say no, this isn't wacko, then they wouldn't be able to do it. And the UN is one of the many places that gives that fake legitimacy. So, and it doesn't have the taint of being an American, partisan industry. Because even the Brookings Institute, even though they're somewhat bipartisan, they still lean left, right? So those will still get slammed. But the UN, I mean, you can hate on the UN, but it's an international body. It's hard to accuse them of being on partisan grounds the way I'm accusing them right now. So that's my biggest issue with the UN.
That's really basically what I said in other words. So we're really in agreement on that. I wasn't saying the UN was like had no influence, but I'm saying the UN, the language of human rights and of like universal morality or objective morality or whatever is kind of put forward as that is what the UN is supposed to stand for, even though it is not what it's ultimately about. I don't think the power, quote unquote, is with the UN. I think that's really what I was trying to say. The power is with the technocrats. And the UN is just, again, another like outlet that the technocrats are using. I mean, in principle, like, I mean, you can understand. I understand exactly why the UN like happened. After Europe was devastated after World War, and people were like, well, we have to do something to prevent a world war, right? So what did they do? They created the UN. And so again, that's not necessarily a bad thing to want to do find some a way of like trying to prevent another devastating world war. But again, like my issue with like a historical figure such as Woodrow Wilson is because he was like the beginning of he was like the first cock crow of the technocratic revolution. He was like one of the first people who was like kind of thinking in that general direction, even though it's like, I would say that the revolution really hasn't taken place until the 2010s or so. It's like been building up, but I really think we're experiencing it right now. But people such as Woodrow Wilson, the language they were using and the ideas they were putting forward were just the beginning of what we're experiencing. And I know you're not a fan of Woodrow Wilson either. So you're not going to defend him. So I'm really trying to think of it historically. Like I said, I'm trying to look at the path that we've taken as a species, as a country, et cetera, as the world, and then look at so where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Those three kind of parts of the whole.
So there are a couple more points on that note that I want to get at a little bit. Okay, so one of the things I pointed to, and I think that this is on the where we're going trend, and it's kind of on the how it's been trend for a while, but and I don't want this to be taken as an attack on your views, although I am going to be attacking your views in the sense that your views, I think, line up with the policies that these international organizations push. But one thing that I think solidifies a lot of their power is by taking power out of individuals. And a lot of the ways that they've, I mentioned crisis, and one of the powers of crisis is when something bad happens that's very unexpected or people are unprepared for, they turn to the central body, because a lot of people, even people who their instincts are against government, think, well, if a government exists, it should at least be serving these rare crisis moments. So they leverage those things, right? So they try to frame kind of everything as a crisis. What I'm seeing is more and more people rely more and more on government forces, or at least have the perception of it. And then this is in the government's interest, because the more we rely on them, the harder it is to break free or go against them. I find this concerning, because it means people have less recourse against their government if they rely on it. Now, you can say to me like, hey, Matt, you don't like the government. You don't want to rely on the government. Why don't you just not rely on them, and then you can go against them? And I say, that's a fair point, because we're talking about me. But there are a lot of people who kind of have it sprung on them. They're not particularly ideologically driven politically. They might not even be particularly politically active, and they rely on government for whatever reason. Well, because they have a grant, because they're a college student, because and those things always come with certain conditions, right? Because if you drop out, you might have penalties. So all sorts of things, and then something is sprung on them that they don't expect, and that might not be ideological to them. It's just a deal breaker to them. So it would be like, if imagine they've decided that not enough poor urban folk were getting vaccinated, so they decided to make that a qualification on getting certain types of welfare benefits, right? If something like that happened, that would be very shocking for a lot of urban folk that probably aren't very ideologically driven, that aren't vaccinated and maybe are skeptical of it. So like, the thing I'm concerned about is the more they solidify power and the more they make people reliant on them as a structure, the more they can add on requirements, prerequisites to get the benefits. And this isn't really new. This happens more and more with like all sorts of state and local fundings from federal government too, on that end too. So that makes it harder for like a county to really not secede, but to go against the grain. That's that type of, what's the word for it? I don't want to say it's making everybody the same, but there's a scientific term. I'm not good with words today, apparently. But I just think that's just a scary trend, right? I'm not even trying to call out anything in particular with it. I guess I'm concerned by the fact that we're having this conversation and agreeing on a lot, but I think a lot of your views line up with a lot of the agenda. And it's not that your values line up with the international organizations, but it's that your policies do. And even if you're not pushing the policies for the reason they are, I'm concerned about the reasons they're pushing their policies. And I'm surprised those reasons aren't a red flag to you. So maybe that's the conversation I wanted to dive into a little bit.
I mean, we're going to have a general conversation, because again, you'd have to show me specific, we'd have to do policy for policy to really break it down entirely. But I actually think, I don't think that criticism is fair of me now. I think that criticism would have been fair of me a couple years ago. And because I did realize that a lot of the liberal policies that are put forward, they are serving the interests of this global hierarchy that is forming and solidifying its power and influence. But I mean, I guess I've come to a wall when it comes to the individualism conversation. I just think some form of I never expect to be a totally quote unquote sovereign being. I just expect someone somewhere to always have some sort of authority over me. And so if I'm still defending some kind of state of some sort, that's why. And at the same time, you could argue, and I don't really even want to argue it because I'm still formulating my ideas in real time, and two, I don't think there are solutions to the problems we're talking about. There really aren't. There aren't solutions to human relations. But at the same time, you could make the argument that if people in certain if certain people got into power in certain governments, they might be able to fight the international order, which is why I was talking about nationalism versus internationalism. And so I could see someone making the argument, and I'm not even saying I agree with this, I'm still thinking about it, but I could see someone making the argument that they are a statist because they want to fight this global elite, and they want to become more independent, self-sufficient, more free, if you'll pardon the phrase. And what they have to do is then they have to use a government body, or they have to use the state to that end. Again, I don't even think that's really a long-term solution, but it is an argument I've heard, and it's not necessarily one that I think is inherently bad. The issue, I guess, the only issue with that really is it's very hard because this global hierarchy is becoming so influential. It is very hard for people who don't want to perpetuate the global order to become get into the necessary positions of power where they could change that global order. And at the same time, we are seeing some of these nationalist figures. Not only are they fighting the global order, but they're also smuggling in racism or anti-Semitism or other toxic ideas. So you can have strange bedfellows sometimes when you're like fighting these issues.
So I agree with all that, and I think we kind of covered a lot of that in our episode on practical politics to some degree. I wanted to run something by you, and then I'll tie it in. It's this idea that I've name dropped a few times to you, but I've never given you more meat on the bones, so it is going to be very new to you. But I actually just had a Twitter interaction with this guy. He's a YouTuber and a podcast host. His name Popular Liberty, and he has this theory of political power called archetropism, and it's kind of like it's almost like using certain language in like the laws of thermodynamics, but comparing it to political power. So like he defines archetropism as the process by which the state goes through extracting order from chaos, or the process of turning a society to a state derived from order. And he has like laws of archetropism and things that feed into it. And so a second law of archetropism is power always seeks consolidation from lower concentration to higher concentration. And that's something that's like seems inevitably true to me. So, and I think that's kind of like, I don't want to say that's profound, but it's like the policy failure that I think happens when I hear a lot of things from a normal statist. So they'll kind of say, I'm in favor of this thing. I'm not in favor of the amalgam it turns into. But the way I'm thinking is like, well, the amalgam is the inevitable consequence of that first thing you're in favor of. So now the way I'm reorienting myself to think about policy is what policies have the guardrails on them to keep them from becoming that amalgamation. Because I think the real issue isn't that every individual voter is a fascist, maybe. It's more something along the lines of people have an okay idea that can be co-opted very easily, and they aren't inhibiting people from co-opting it. They aren't doing anything about it, and there's nothing in the policy that really stops that from happening. So he's put forward some ideas that are kind of meant to, here's a policy that a government could put forward that could actually, in the long run, cut against the power dynamics of the state. So, like, I'm not against the idea of like somebody running for an office to institute things that work in the direction against the state or the direction of localizing power again. And that's kind of what you're saying about how if a person runs to be president and they're a nationalist and they're trying to relocalize from internationalism to nationalism, that doesn't mean they're really a statist. I'm just kind of saying that on an even more granular level. And I don't want to be pure about it either. Like, I don't want to like accuse them of being a statist or not for that reason. But I think that's the tie-in is how do we keep the guardrails on things? Like what breaks can we start implementing on a piece of policy so they don't get out of hand? Because I kind of dropped the hint earlier. I think internationalism was the logical conclusion of nationalism a little bit, or at least becoming first world nations. So that's not because the people are uniquely evil. I think it's just like there weren't rails on the power of the people. So maybe that's something that we might be able to make common ground on, at least talking about as something that would make more sense.
Well, I'm probably going to have to answer your question a little more broadly if you don't mind. But the guardrails really are, in my view, just uncertainty and the. So, okay, back to what I said earlier, like the possibility of like, after a certain amount of time of like technocratic rule, then something happens that breaks up that technocratic rule. So like, I mean, I'd have to like really like study the matter historically, but I don't mind like for the sake of argument, I don't mind agreeing that yes, the more power a government gets, the more, or like as government power increases government power increases over time, and that many things start to, just exponentially increase that power. But from my reading of history, really what happens is at some point, something just becomes a government becomes too lethargic or becomes too big or too bureaucratic. And then it breaks up again, and then it builds up again, and then it breaks up again. It's like a cycle of growth and death and growth and death. Mm-hmm. And there's always there's conflicts between elites, and there's, revolts of, common people revolting because they want bread or something. There's religious conflicts. So I don't really ever see one person or one group or one government ever having too much power for too long. If you look at everything from the big picture perspective. I mean, at least it's a very strong possibility.
So I think that raised the question to me then, okay, because I agree with you. I think like entropy is national. I mean, I think it's natural, and I think that there will be decay, and I think things will collapse. I guess I'm kind of questioning why you think it's been so durable thus far recently. And the thing I would posit as the answer to that is if you ever look up a trend on economic productivity, and if you look at like one of the really if you zoom out really far, so the time scale goes back like hundreds and hundreds of years, then productivity looks like a hockey stick, right? It's really low, and then all of a sudden it spikes, and that's what I would say technological innovation has really done. So I almost think like, yes, these organizations are doing things that inhibit all these things. They aren't robust. They have all these. They're very fallible, but in spite of that, the base of people they rule over has become so obsessively productive in terms of technology that like it doesn't matter, and they still maintain hegemony, for at least for now. So I'm not sure if you're thinking, but our current system is inevitable and robust, or if you have a different explanation than the one I just gave.
I mean, I think there's like two, I guess, two facts we have to keep in mind. I mean, I think even a bad system can probably particularly, the U.S. government, I think is a really great example. Even a bad system can feed off itself and can sustain itself at least for a while. Nothing lasts forever. Eventually, I think all power all systems of power probably collapse or just like get broken up or various balkanized, whatever. So I guess both things, like, it's true that I think things inevitably lead to collapse, but at the same time, it can take a really long time. I mean, the Roman Empire, for example, was falling for like 400-ish years. Like the time when the time that historians think was like extremely decadent within Rome, and like with all the horrible emperors that like Rome had, like they still kept the Roman Empire was still intact until 400 years later, when the Western Empire crashed and the Eastern kept going into the Middle Ages. The British Empire, with all its problems, lasted 400-ish years. So I don't think it's really even a contradiction to say like the system's crumbling and it's going to be long lasting. But you have to really think about it at the macro scale. And as I said earlier, I don't really know, like, I'm conflicted as to whether I think the technocrats are going to, be kind of just in power indefinitely for a really, really long time, or if they too are going to fall out of favor, or then something else is going to come up in its place. That's just that's a question that I just don't think anyone really has the answer to at this time. I think we should err on the side of caution and really, I guess, fight the technocrats in the sense that I am concerned at what they're going to do. And I'm concerned that they could be in power for a really, really long time. But at the same time, I don't think I think there is also the strong possibility that all complexity ends up breaking down at some point.
And I think I generally agree with that. Well, since I want to wrap up here in a minute, I do want to give like my parting takeaway or my parting thought. And it's just kind of for people who are concerned of this, I think the answer is to decentralize and individualize. I don't mean that politically. I mean that in the sense of like you yourself are at a lot of risks to exogenous shocks because of these international organizations we're talking about. So like just financially, pretty much everybody has the majority of their money in something that's based on the US dollar. And I'm not saying the US dollar is going to collapse now in 5 years or in 10 years. What I'm saying is you are trusting in a system that is run by people who generally don't have your best interest at heart. They do have the interest of wanting to keep the dollar strong, but that doesn't mean they're going to be successful at it. So I think there are answers that are like, hey, these are the types of risks that if you invest in a low income pension fund that's supposed to give you a small safe return, these are the tail risks that they can't actually really hedge against. Like, and these are the shocks that people are opening themselves up to pretty much just by having most of their money in dollars or investments. And I find that concerning. So I think really the answer is to not rely on these systems if possible, hedge your risk against these systems. And to some extent, that kind of means you might have to intentionally resegregate yourself into people that somewhat think like you. Because, it wouldn't surprise me if people really lean into the Bitcoin is dangerous for the environment language, and then all of a sudden we find out that they're trying to ban Bitcoin or put fines on anybody who owns Bitcoin in certain regions. And I guess what I'm saying is you do what you have to do if you're concerned about what international organizations have control over you. Then you might want to individualize, not out of moral principle, not out of moral virtue, but out of, I guess, what I would say is caution, because the system doesn't really take your input seriously. And the best you can do is protect yourself. So that's kind of my takeaway from the big picture we're dancing around. But I'll let you get your word in, and then I'll sign us off.
So my takeaway is really more doomer. I hate that word, but it's a common word on the internet, so I'm going to use it. My take is very doomer-esque because I really don't have anything to say to people as to, so the other day we did a conversation about what's the revolutionary mentality, and I came on the side of political activism is a good thing, and I still think political activism is a good thing, but I think the U.S. government is unsalvageable. I think we have to, if I'm actually like trying to put forward some solution, what we need to do is scrap it and start all over. And there are various things you can do. I mean, there is like more local. If you want to like get food locally. I mean, that's something you could do. I think localism often can be like people kind of not take it too seriously, but they think they're doing more than they are. But I mean, that is something you could do, being a little more self-sufficient, trying to get involved in local affairs, even getting involved in national affairs, I think can have an influence. But ultimately, I am very pessimistic, and I really don't have a really advice for people except to just, I guess, do whatever you think is right and try to fight for whatever you think is right. But I mean, the U.S. government, of course, is just you mentioned, I don't think this was on air, but you mentioned oligarchies. And the U.S., of course, is at this point it always has been to a degree, but I think particularly now it's a oligarchy with democratic tendencies. And I don't think that's really a functional system. And it's definitely not a democratic system that I would like to see. But yeah, I mean, I think the conflict that we're experiencing is just going to have to play itself out, and it's not necessarily going to be pretty. And I don't know who's going to win or who's going to lose, and I don't know what the end result is going to be. But history keeps on going. That is really if there's any wisdom you gain from this podcast, I guess that would be my closing statement. History keeps on going, and we're all part of history in some minor way.
Got it. Well, I'll let you have the last word there. I mean, I know we can talk about these types of issues all day, and I know that there's so many thoughts that dance around them too. There's a lot to investigate, but we'll spare everybody from hearing 2 hours on it for now, especially because I have my own time constraints. That's my excuse. Okay, so you can find more of Matt's content. He has the podcast, the Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. I'm still struggling with words today. You can find me on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck, and you can find the Obey podcast, which is something I do from time to time. We also name drop Keegan. Keegan has the Nietzsche podcast, and that's what I believe Matt was featured on, but I could be wrong. And you can find Matthew on Twitter, but I don't remember his handle off the top of my head, so he can explain what it is, as we do now ritually at the end of each episode.
So it's my name, but cut off the OD and add an 8.
Yeah, that's what it's
Matthew Hazel Woe 8.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I should have remembered that. And you can find Beyond Talking Points. I don't know how you're consuming this audio right now. It's either through YouTube or a podcatcher, but you can always find it on YouTube or through a podcatcher, or you can just Google Beyond Talking Points and you'll find our content there. We have 70 plus episodes in the backlog, and we've talked about all sorts of things. And not to brag, but a lot of stuff we do talk about isn't particularly timely. It's like evergreen. So like you can always revisit the idea of thinking about what Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson have to say. It doesn't matter if it's September of 2019 or not. And there are some conversations that I like the idea of revisiting. But we do bother with engaging in the debates that are not grounded in the day-to-day news cycle. Because if you've only been listening to the day-to-day news cycle, you probably haven't heard anything except Afghanistan for like 2 weeks now. And that's going to be outdated in 3 months. But you can, if you dig into our feed more than a few months back, there are stuff we cover that is very still timely, and it's still ever present in the discourse. So I just want to throw that out there. But otherwise, sign off for now is Matt. Thank you.